Hello, BookTube. I went to the Brattle today. It was a blue sky day. It wasn't cold. It wasn't raining. It wasn't sleeting. Um, so I went to the Brattle bookshop and I got a bunch of books. I got a small pile of books. I don't need them at all. I get tons of books in the mail, but I want to show them to you anyway. and uh, and the what have we got here? Seven. I've got 7 books here, and of the 7 books, 5 of them are extremely Beltway. They're extremely Washington D.C. type books. So I want to start off with the 2 that aren't. The first one is a collection of short stories. This is uh, a book that when did this come out? 2012, something like that. 2014. I read it when I got a galley, and I read it, and I thought, okay, that's not all that remarkable. It didn't strike me as all that remarkable. And then I got the finished copy and I read that, and to give it a second try, and I thought, okay, there's definitely some insight here, but I don't see much happening with this. And then it got showered in praise, reviewed everywhere, and not only that, more importantly than that, in this case, it has been handed from reader to reader in so many circumstances, in so many environments, and in so many countries, that I have heard so much about this book and what it has done for readers that I've thought for a long time that it needed a reread. And so when a copy cropped up at the Brattle, the Brattle Bookshop, for those of you who are new, there are quite a few of you who are new. It's a used bookstore here in Boston. They have a 3-story building. The first 2 floors are ordinary used bookstore, a very well stocked used bookstore, and then the 3rd floor is antique and collectible books. But then there's a lot next door, a whole building's worth of a lot next door that is full of bargain books. $1, $3, and $5 bargain books, most of them in fine condition and replenished all the time. All the time. There were 2 young employees at the Brattle just today, just this morning, working hard, bringing out lorries worth of new books for that lot, because there are customers in there all the time. I think, and everything I got today was from the lot. Everything I bought today was from the sale lot, and it's amazing because you can go out there and you can fill an arm with books without knowing that you're not going to be spending an arm and a leg. You're not going to be spending a huge amount of money, even if you shop exclusively $5 books. You're still going to be getting brand new stuff for. Oh, anyway. The book is this. It's Philip Clay's book, Redeployment. And it's about the Iraq War. It's about the stories are all sorts of different ramifications of people, of soldiers coming home from the Iraq War. And some of them are very vigorous. The premises of some of them are very vigorous. There's one soldier in one of these stories whose job it was overseas to shoot dogs who were otherwise going to eat corpses. And all of a sudden that was his job every day, to get up and do that for a whole shift. And all of a sudden he has to come back home and readjust. And a whole bunch of other things too. I mean, the refrain that runs through a lot of these stories is how little the civilian population knows about anything that was going on, and even where these men were, much less what they were doing. I'm going to try this again. A lot of critics that I respect loved this book, or at least honored it, thought that, esteemed it, and I'm going to give it another try. I feel I've been wanting to for a while, and I never resist the karma of the Brattle sale carts. You have all sorts of, you're bookish people just like I am. You, in the course of a week, you develop all sorts of different bookish thoughts and whimsies and directions and intentions one way or another, and you don't file them, you don't write them down or anything. But at the Brattle, they come alive, and you can all of a sudden get reminded by something that's $1 in front of you. So you're obviously going to buy it. You can get reminded of an intention that you had a week ago, 2 weeks ago, a month ago. I never resist that karma at the Brattle, and as a result, the Brattle will provide. That's another thing I always say about the Brattle Bookshop here in Boston, is that it will provide. If I encounter a lack, if I discover something that I need, as long as I don't push it, as long as I don't expect it, go in, impatiently tapping my toe, the Brattle will provide. And a perfect example of that happened today at the Brattle sale carts. I found this, W.K. Jordan's Edward VI, the Young King, the other day, just 2 or 3 days ago, in my biography bookshelf tour. I showed you Jordan's second book. He did a 2-volume biography of Edward VI. And the first one was The Young King, no, this is the second one. The other book was The Threshold of Power. And I remember saying to you, a thought that I've had every time I go by that biography shelf, which is, boy, why on earth don't I have both volumes? I should have both volumes of the most exhaustive biography of Edward VI that's ever been written or is ever likely to be written. And here it is. So I will reinforce this if it needs to be reinforced. I will put a small mark in it to let myself know that this copy came through my hands, and then I will just make room for it on the royalty shelf of my biography section, right next to the other volume. So there's a perfect example of the Brattle providing. But then all the rest of this is Washingtonian. All the rest of this is American politics at what is revoltingly referred to as the corridors of power. And the first one, the first one was $1. It was dirt cheap. I've read it already. I came that close to reviewing it, but I thought that maybe I wouldn't be able to be objective. I used to live in Washington, briefly. I had a brief Washington interlude, and I had some connection with the aforementioned corridors of power. And I also fell in love with the city and its suburbs. I fell in love with it, even though it's a swamp. It's literally not the metaphorical swamp of drain the swamp, but a literal swamp. It's a literal swamp. In the summer, it is unlivable. It's so hot and so crushingly humid. I have been to jungles in South America that have more bearable humidity than Washington in the summer. And yet I spent time there. I spent years there. And one of the phenomenon that I've mentioned on this channel in connection with Washington many times, one of the phenomenon going back 200 years is that it's of course the home to masculine power, senators, congressmen, cabinet members, presidents. But it's also been the home for 200 years to a very potent kind of feminine power. The power brokers in Washington, D.C. for maybe not now, maybe not in the present day, but once upon a time, especially when the idea of grand entertaining and visiting and having huge to-do parties, those sorts of things don't so much happen anymore. All you need is one president and one first lady who don't care about such things to break the spell. That's all you need, is for one administration to come in that doesn't really care about such things. Like, for instance, the Carters didn't really care about such things. Also, George W. Bush and his wife, Laura, didn't really give any fuel to that kind of an atmosphere. So I'm not sure that this atmosphere exists anymore. When I was in Washington, it did exist. It was in full swing. And these parties, those get-togethers, those massive banquets, were presided over by Washington hostesses, by Washington matrons, who were a species unto themselves and wielded enormous amounts of soft power with legitimate results. And I have often thought that the truly definitive work on that phenomenon has not yet been written. And I was thinking that, something made me think that. I was reading, because of the biography bookshelf tour, I was rereading a book by Lars Anderson's wife. He was a diplomat in Washington forever and ever. He was one very much on the masculine side of power, and she was very much a hostess with the mostest on the feminine side. I was rereading her book, Presidents and Pies, and that just sort of lodged in my mind the thought that, a really great, big, detailed, and intelligent book on that subject hasn't been written in modern times. And that made me think, well, okay, yeah, but there was a book on that subject. That it just wasn't any of those things. It was this. It was C. David Heyman's book, The Georgetown Ladies Social Club. The phenomenon that I'm talking about got that kind of informal name. This informal name was given to it by Ronald Reagan, who very much loved the phenomenon. And Nancy Reagan did too, although she didn't particularly like. She was kind of accustomed to being the queen regnant in that kind of a social circle. Certainly in California she was, once she was the governor's wife. And especially once she was the president's wife, she could go back and expect studio heads to kowtow to her. But Washington doesn't work that way. And Washington doesn't care about that. Oh! It's my own hostess with the mostest. Hello, Bean. we've had a wonderful, wonderful day together. So she's extra friendly. But anyway, uh, this is a profile of 5 of those matrons, and one of them doesn't really belong. This is a profile of Catherine Graham, Lorraine Cooper, Evangeline Bruce, Pamela Harriman, and Sally Quinn. And these ladies, their time in Georgetown largely overlapped, and a lot of them knew each other. And I would argue that Kay Graham doesn't really belong there. Yes, she did all the stuff that these ladies did. Held the parties, took the ambassadors or the cabinet members aside to have a word with them, a quiet word with them that would then become law. Knew everybody, and had the satellite homes elsewhere. She did all of that stuff that were the key appurtenances of these women. But she also held actual power, not just on the one side of the aisle, but on the other side of the divide that I'm talking about. So I don't know that I would include her, although I guess you have to. You absolutely have to. But the problem that I had with this book when it first came out, this is, I think, 20 years old. 2003. Okay, so not quite 20 years old. But the problem that I had with this book is that it's shallow. It's gossip. It's often very entertaining gossip, and sometimes, as is true with gossip, sometimes it's accurate. But the main problem that I had with this is that it's not the kind of treatment that I think this phenomenon deserves. And maybe it's had that book and I've just missed it. Could very well be. Or maybe Kay Graham's own book, Catherine Graham's Washington, is that book, and that's as close as I'm ever going to come. I don't know. One way or another, when you're reading this book, you get, it's invaluable. You have to, if you want to study this phenomenon, you obviously have to have this book and you have to know it. You just have to take it with a huge grain of salt, especially since an unhealthy amount of the energy of this book seems to be devoted to slinging dirt at Sally Quinn, the last in chronological order of the ladies profiled in this book. A lot of the animus in this book seems to be just pettily negative towards her. Now, she was a preposterous figure, but she doesn't deserve that, especially if you're singling her out to do it in the company of other women who, not Catherine Graham, but the other women in this book could be every bit as preposterous. They didn't make a full-time job out of it like Sally Quinn did, but nevertheless, there's an imbalance, is what I'm trying to say. It's way too short for the subject that it's trying to do, because it goes after gossip instead of social importance, instead of actual weight. So there's a huge amount on Catherine Graham. The bulk of the book is about her. And there's a large amount about Sally Quinn that's all vicious, backbiting gossip that's unsubstantiated. So I got it because I don't have it, and this is a pet subject of mine. I love the social side of Washington. And like I said, you have to read this book if you're interested in that subject. I don't know too many people who are. And I realized when I saw it that I didn't have it, and I'd just been thinking about it and its deficiencies. So I'll read it again and see if maybe there's a little more heft to it than I thought. I doubt it. I doubt it very much. Then this next one, we're going to go back in time. This is still the Beltway. This is still Washington, but we're going to go back in time. This is William Lee Miller, President Lincoln. The subtitle is The Duty of a Statesman. This is the author of a book called Lincoln's Virtues that was just, as you could tell from the title, it was largely syrup from beginning to end. And yet, even so, in Lincoln's Virtues, even so, when I was reading it, I was thinking, well, this is, the author would smack you in the head. The subject, Lincoln himself, would smack you in the head for doing a lot of this. This is mostly undisguised hagiography. But it's really knowledgeable, and it's written with a large amount of energetic sympathy. And this book is about Lincoln as president, and is terrific. It purges away almost all of the starry-eyed devotion of the earlier book, and instead leaves the enthusiastic sympathy. So I'm very picky about my Lincoln books. There've been a million of them, and I'm kind of picky about which ones I have. Because otherwise you could have I have thousands of books here at Hyde Cottage, and that number of Lincoln books has been written. I could literally fill this entire place, swap out every book here for a Lincoln book, and I still wouldn't run out of them. Although 2019 and 2018 have been curiously light on the Lincoln books. I think we're getting Sidney Blumenthal's next big book on Lincoln. He's doing an old-fashioned 19th century multi-volume biography of Lincoln, and I think his next one is coming out this autumn. the autumn of this year, and that series has been getting better as it goes along, as it gets closer to the immortal Lincoln, the Lincoln as president, the tragic Lincoln. So if that comes out this year, that'll be an exception. But ordinarily, by now, we're almost midway through the year. By now, I've expected to see 6 Lincoln books. I haven't. Maybe I've just missed them. But one way or another, this is a Lincoln book that I know I wanted, and I didn't have a copy. So this will turn up in our biography tour, because I now have 3 Lincoln books. I have a soup to nuts biography. I have a great book by Harold Holzer on President-elect Lincoln before he took office, which is, you would think that would be the worst of all, but it's fantastic, just fantastic. And now I have this one. I don't have Donald Hall's book. I don't have Carl Sandburg's book, and a whole bunch of others. I don't have a whole bunch of others, and I don't particularly want them. Lincoln's never really done it for me the way other U.S. presidents have. I know that's heresy, because he is objectively speaking one of the most interesting stories. Nevertheless, I think 3 will be good, unless Sidney Blumenthal's next book is terrific. 3 will probably be good. So I got this one, and then we go to back to the modern day. In fact, we're going to shoot past Lincoln. We're going to step firmly to the other side of that divide between soft and hard power, and we're going to look at 2 Galumphers and a thinner book on the corridors of power. Very much the corridors of power. First one is something I have been kind of sort of hoping I would find. I had a copy when it first came out. I got rid of it, but I am coming to terms with the fact that this broader period from the Reagan era to the present, it has gigantic tomes all over it, and I'm coming to terms with the fact that this is a period I am going to want to live in for a while. I'm going to want these primary books, even though they were written by lawyers and vetted by lawyers and also vetted by liars. So their historical probity is extremely suspect. You can't use these things as primary sources, even though a number of marquee biographers, big-name biographers, have decided, with a kind of willful naivete, to use these books as primary sources. Well, if Sandy Berger says that's what happened in a one-on-one private meeting that would otherwise have condemned him as a war criminal, well, then he must be telling the truth. It's that sort of thing. It's akin to trusting Reagan's own memoirs as anything other than historical curios or inadvertent insights into the psychologies of the people involved. But you can't use them. Anyway, this is one of those books, but this is considerably heftier. This is The Politics of Diplomacy by James Baker III, who was an enormously influential figure in American politics. There he is, cramming on briefing papers. He was never without them. The current world of Washington doesn't have anyone like this person. I was not his biggest fan when he was wielding all the power in the world, but the current political world has no one like him. No one like him at all. Let me see here. By any reckoning, James Baker's years as Secretary of State contained some of the most pivotal events of the second half of the 20th century, and few men played as critical a role in so many of them as Baker himself. And that is the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. This is Pope John Paul II. This is Margaret Thatcher. This is a gigantic era in American history, and this is the guy who was right there at it all. Often joked about as people often repeated the same kind of joke that it took them 25 minutes to remember that Jim Baker was in the room, and then they realized how many rooms he'd been in. That's a talent. That's an old spook's talent. And this is it's heftily and entertainingly written. I will definitely give it a reread. It belongs on the same shelf with George Shultz's book, which we've seen in the biography tour and we'll see again. And this next was another example of the Brattle providing. I have praised on this channel, and I'm very happy to see that other critics have also praised George Packer's book, Our Man, about Richard Holbrooke, who was a firebrand fixture in the State Department for decades. Never quite became Secretary of State, but nevertheless put a huge imprint on American foreign policy, especially during Clinton administration. And George Packer wrote a weird, impressionistic, very affectionate book. Our Man is a remarkable reading experience. It doesn't read like the memory of a high-level diplomat in the American service at all. It reads like a stillborn Fitzgerald novel. Just stylistic gambles on every page, and I think they pay off. And when you're reading about Dick Holbrook, I mean, the book's all about him. The book's all about his strutting egotism and his genuine accomplishments, and also his weird compulsiveness and his tinny solipsism. Just it's a warts and all portrait in which the portrait painter seems to love even the warts. That's kind of strange. But one of the things that you remember about him is that he ghost wrote a memoir of another person, and of Clark Clifford, who was everything that Dick Holbrook dreamed of being and never was. Everything. He's everything that everyone in certain corridors, in certain levels of power in Washington, dreamed of being, and almost nobody was. I mean, James Baker comes close. But Richard Holbrook co-wrote the book Counsel to the President, and here it is. this big thing. Wonderfully graceful writing. Wonderfully so. Clark Clifford, let me give you an idea. A legendary advisor to America's presidents, has written a classic memoir. Richard Holbrook had a large hand in this book, but you have to say that for the dust jacket. Clifford was Harry Truman's White House counsel. He was John F. Kennedy's personal lawyer, and he was Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of State at the height of the Vietnam War, which he objected to. He participated in virtually all of the great national and security decisions since World War II, and today remains an active and influential member of Washington's inner circles. He was very much a part of the world that I opened with. And this, I remember when this came out, was this in the 90s? 1991. I remember when this came out, I thought it was going to be a snooze fest, and it's remarkably gracefully written, beautifully, energetically, picturesquely written. And there's a fairly open secret that was mostly Richard Holbrook's doing. And in the time since then, I have had occasion to reflect many, many times on how different a lot of careers would be if writing nonfiction paid. I mean, yes, $17 million to Barack Obama for a memoir that we have not seen yet. 7 million, what was it that Clinton got and cashed and spent and then didn't deliver forever and ever and ever until finally he had to deliver his book? If every writer of nonfiction got that kind of money, Richard Holbrook might have been satisfied writing instead of constantly striving to be, the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. Now, you could say, okay, well, if he had done that, then we wouldn't have had the Dayton Accords, because maybe he was the only one in the room who could have hammered them together. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. But we wouldn't have a lot of his failures either, and who knows how many other people as well. And I'm not talking just about diplomats, of course. I'm talking about novelists. I mean, can you read everything that Jonathan Franzen, not to revert to my bête noir of American fiction, but can you read everything that he's written, not just his novels, but his nonfiction as well? Can you really read those things and not come away with the impression that he would have been happier writing nonfiction his whole life, but that there was no money in it? I don't think that's possible. I don't think you can come to that conclusion. And that's true of a lot of people. Anyway, I was thinking about this book the whole time I was reading Our Man. I was thinking, it's terrible that I don't have a copy of Counsel to the President. This is a huge life. This is a huge effect on a large amount of American history. It's a crime that I don't have a copy of that book. I had it back in 1991. I had a copy. And I remember thinking, when I was reading Our Man, I was thinking, well, the Brattle will provide. Sooner or later, you will see a copy of Counsel to the President at the Brattle, and then you'll just snatch it up and then do your best not to lose it again. And I did. So there you go. There's a few examples of the Brattle providing. So that was my Brattle trip. Counsel to the President. There's a couple of big galumphers here. Counsel to the President, The Politics of Diplomacy, which could just as easily have been called the Diplomacy of Politics. It would have worked either way. It's James Baker's book, the one that everybody knew he was going to write, and then he did. Then we have President Lincoln. The subtitle is The Duty of a Statesman, and it's terrific. I can't wait to reread it. I'm sure that I will learn a lot. I'm sure there's a lot more that I've thought and learned about Lincoln since I originally read it. Then the Georgetown Ladies Social Club. I will give this a fair reread. Nobody cares anymore. It's never going to be reprinted. It's gone. And if there's another book on the subject, it will be very different, I hope. So nobody cares. Anyway, I'm not even sure if the author is still with us. But I'll give it a fair rereading. and see if maybe I can see past the gossip to something else that might be going on. I'm not sure that the author is still alive, and I hate to say this, I'm not sure that Sally Quinn is still alive. I don't know one way or another. Then we have Redeployment by Philip Clay. I will give this another try. Again, I could easily, considering the hosannas of praise, and considering how popular this is on U.S. military servicemen and women now, swear by this book, and they pass around dog-eared copies. So, given that fact, I might want to look at it again. And then Edward VI, The Young King, by W.K. Jordan, which is another example of the Brattle providing. But you notice this is the wrong number of books. I just noticed when I was looking down here that I forgot one book. I got one other Washingtonian book. Only this one is not. We saw two big self-satisfied memoirs, and a self-satisfied piece of gossip and whatnot. This is very much different. This is an angry book, and I remember loving it when it first came out, even though I tend to find its author insufferable. And I'm going to give it another try, because I figured if I'm getting these many Washingtonian books and so many of them are celebratory, I need to get an angry book. It's important to remember that the decisions made by these men affected real lives, ended real lives. That's important to remember. And if this book doesn't remind you of that fact, nothing will. This is by Vincent Bugliosi, the famous Manson trial, and the guy who wrote Reclaiming History, the longest book that I have ever read, and in my opinion, the longest book ever written, because it's a 2,000-page biography of the JFK assassination that has a disc in the back with 2,000 more pages of notes that are written in narrative form. They're not op-sit and whatnot. They're written as text. So the thing is immense. And this is the prosecution of George W. Bush for murder. A much shorter book and very much to the point, where Vincent Bugliosi, as a lawyer, look at the end papers, utterly damning. No old men, no old women. These people will never grow old. And in this book, he does his best to lay out a legal case that George W. Bush knowingly committed murder, because he knew that he led the country to war under false pretenses, and he knew that fatalities would result. And he even tried to cover it up. This is absolute sinus-clearing writing. Just the angriest book that Bugliosi ever wrote, and in my opinion, the only angry book that he ever wrote, and a very important counterbalance to some of these big memoirs of these men who never went to The Hague. They never stood a moment in a war crimes docket, never, and they never will. It's important to remember that books like this exist and that they have a reason to exist. So well, add this to the pile. I don't need to do another pyramid. But that was my Brattle trip. Very satisfying. Don't know when I'll be back to the Brattle. I always mean to go, but the day dawns and it's either too cold or it's sleeting, or in the case of good weather, I have the option. I can either go to the Brattle and deal with crazy people on the subway and lug books there and back, or I can sprawl on the couch with the cutest dog in the world and write to my heart's content in a completely empty and quiet building. Which would you do? How tempting would you find that? I don't know. Maybe you would find it more tempting because not everybody has access to something like the Brattle. So you might go every day. And there were long stretches of time in my own life where I went every day. So I would understand that. But anyway, another hugely long video. Sorry about that. I'm going to wrap this up. These will be the only two videos today. So I will be back tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.